right now in Kiddopolis, and I wanted to honor her by picking one of her favorite movies of all time to show a video clip from, even though this particular clip talks about fathers. Okay? Let's go ahead and put it on the screen.
I'll never join you. If you only knew the power of the dark side. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No. I am your father. No. It's not true. That's impossible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
Okay. These days I watch that and I just kind of get cracked up over Mark Hamill's acting ability. But nonetheless, when I was 10 years old, I saw that movie in the theater. And I remember, first of all, wondering, what in the world? How could a robot be Luke's father? Like I didn't know anything about the facts of life, but I knew that much. I knew robots couldn't, so I was confused. I really believed Darth Vader was a robot for the whole time. I never even understood there could be a human being inside that thing. Because, C-3PO was a robot. Anyway, so I remember leaving the theater both confused and, as much as a 10-year-old can be, angst-ridden. That, what did this mean? Could Darth Vader literally be Luke's father? What is that? And I spent all summer long just like, what is that? Is he really? And I was looking at newspapers when I'd go shopping with my mom. There'd be like People magazine off to the side, and the front cover would have Darth Vader on it. Is Darth Vader really Luke's father, or something like that? And I would try to read it while my mom was paying for stuff. And I had to wait 3 long years to figure out what's the deal with Darth and Luke, and the whole process of the to be continued really stresses me out. And so when Mark writes in verse 8 that the women left terrified, didn't tell anyone, that really stresses me out. Not just because it's a cliffhanger, not just because it's the kind of story that you want to know the rest of, but there's another reason too. Another reason that really bothered me is the first time I ever saw this and the first time I ever learned that Mark stopped his gospel at verse 8, I was very, very disturbed. Mark was the first gospel that was ever written to tell us about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Okay? I knew that. And so I'm reading the Gospel of Mark, and I find out that all of Jesus' resurrection appearances in Mark come after the line, which means Mark didn't tell us about any resurrection appearances of Jesus. In Mark, we get an empty tomb, we get an angel, we get women who are too scared to say anything, and they run away. And that's how it ends. It just ends there. And I was actually literally disturbed, and I asked myself the question, can I trust the resurrection? Can I trust that it's a historical event, or is this a mythological thing? Maybe since Mark was first, the other guys who wrote said they needed to add a little bit extra to it, and so they made up these other stories. And I was worried about that for a time. And I want to share with you today, from Mark, why we can trust that the resurrection event actually happened. Why we can trust that it actually happened. And I actually believe that the way Mark ends his gospel proves even stronger to us that the resurrection was a real event. Jesus actually was dead, actually was buried, actually came back to life. So walk with me through these thoughts as we go through these specific bullet points. Did the resurrection actually happen? First bullet point, no one expected it. This is important. Because one of the theories about how Jesus' body could have left the tomb is that the disciples stole it. In fact, the ancient Jewish people claimed that that's how it happened, that the disciples stole Jesus' body. Now, this is important because no one before the resurrection expected it, anticipated it, or even wanted it. This is key. Jesus was not the first guy on the scene that people thought was the Messiah. There was another guy named Theudas. There was another guy before that. And these guys had been killed. Okay, the Romans had killed them, or the Jewish people, the leaders of the Jewish tradition had killed them. I don't know who killed them, but different people killed them. And when they were dead, and the movement was dead. It was over. So here's the thing. There were other Messiah-type figures. They died, and never did anyone think the Messiah would come back to life. We know that from these other stories, that no one ever believed that was the story. That was what would happen. Secondarily, Jesus says in Mark 10, I'm going to be killed and I'm going to rise again on the third day. And you know what happens to the disciples? Whoosh! Right over their heads. They don't say anything about it. In fact, they're confused about it. In fact, immediately after Jesus says those words to them, they begin arguing about who's the greatest. It's like, wait a minute, Jesus just said he's going to come back to life from the dead, and now you're arguing about which one of you is the greatest? Different things like that. They didn't expect it. They weren't anticipating it. They didn't think it would help. And so there's no motivation for them to have done it. Number two, the Romans knew how to kill. Some people have said, well, maybe Jesus' body was laid in the tomb, but he wasn't really dead. He was just sort of passed out. And it took 3 days for him to recover enough that he could roll the stone away and get out. And then he snuck off and left the tomb empty, and then later on healed up a little bit and made some appearances to people. But they think that maybe Jesus just, he wasn't actually dead. In fact, that happens to the Apostle Paul. He gets stoned, and people leave thinking he's dead, but he's really just underneath a pile of stones. And when he eventually comes to, he climbs back out and he goes back into the town. So they think that might have happened to Jesus, but it couldn't have happened to Jesus because the Romans were in charge of his death. And these guys knew what they were doing. In fact, Jesus was flogged, and some people died just from the whipping. So by the time he's crucified, he's half dead already. And Pilate asks the centurion, is he really dead? And in chapter 15, verses 44 and 45, the centurion gives testimony that yes, he's really dead. Number three, Joseph. This guy, Joseph of Arimathea, would have been under great scrutiny. He's the guy who buried Jesus. Now, there was a point in time when I tried to imagine for myself all the scenarios of how Jesus' resurrection could have been faked. And the best scenario I ever came up with was this, that Joseph took Jesus' body, and then before putting it in the tomb, he snuck the body away and hid the body somewhere, and then brought to the tomb just a big lump of grave clothes. They laid the grave clothes in there, and that somehow, or maybe he had a back door in the tomb because it was his tomb. Maybe he snuck Jesus out when no one was looking, and then the tomb was empty, and then Joseph of Arimathea could say, well, he's risen. Well, here's an interesting thing. Joseph of Arimathea, if you look in chapter 15, verse 43, you see he's a prominent member of the council. The council there is referring to the Jewish leaders who condemned Jesus to death. That means Joseph of Arimathea was in the room when the high priest was judging Jesus. He was in the space when they were doing this Thursday night thing to try to get Jesus to be killed. He was there. He was a prominent member. And if he's a prominent member, that means people were paying attention to what he did. And for him to step forward and even ask for Jesus' body was taking a huge risk. People would have seen that. For him to take the body down and wrap it was taking a big risk. People would have seen that. For him to carry the body to the tomb was taking a big risk. People would have seen that. And then to bury the body in the tomb was a big risk. People were looking at that. And so he was watched, not the least of which by the women. And this is the next line. The tomb was clearly identified by the women. The same women who had come back on Sunday identified the tomb on Friday. That's in chapter 15, verses 46 and 47. We see Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. The next bullet point. On Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. Now, this is more significant than you and I sometimes think. Because for the tomb to be empty, only two things could have happened. Either the body was carried out or it walked out. And there is no motivation for anybody to carry it out. So the only other option is for it to have walked out. I mean, it's not like there was an earthquake and the stone rolled away and the body kind of slid down the hill, into the river and no one ever found it again. It's not like that could have happened. So either it was carried out or it walked out. And since no one had the motivation to carry it out, it must have walked out. And this is key, because for the tomb to be empty, that means everybody in the area knew where the tomb was. Everybody could have gone and seen it. It wasn't like this secret place off to the side with an unmarked grave where, oh my goodness, we dug it up and there was no one there. Oh, but we've covered it over and the grass has regrown, so you can't see it right now. You'd never be able to find it. No, this tomb was a prominent tomb. Everybody could go there and say, this thing is empty. And that brings us to this next bit. Mark ends his book at verse 8, which I feel unsatisfied by. But according to Mark, he believes that proof is unnecessary. This is remarkable to me. He's talking about a guy who came back to life from the dead, and he thinks proof isn't necessary. Now, I think, for me, that I would want some proof. And so some of the other Gospels give us proof, and some of the additional writings that tacked stuff onto the end of Mark do give us attempts at proof. But what fascinates me is that Mark himself didn't think there was a need for proof. In other words, two things are going on here. Number one, if I were making the story up, I would have put out as much proof as possible. If I'm making it up and I know it's false, I have to convince myself and I have to convince you, so I'm going to put all kinds of extra proof in there. Mark doesn't need proof, which means he thinks, man, this is obvious. I know it sounds outlandish, but it's obvious. Anybody can go to the tomb and see that it's empty. Anybody can go right up the street and talk to Mary. She still lives next door. Anybody can go up the street and talk to the other Mary. She still lives there. And her son Joseph, he's still there. Anybody can talk to these people because, see, Mark is writing just 10 years after this event. And so all the people who were around at that time are still alive. You can go talk to any of them. You want proof? Just talk to Peter. Just talk to this guy over here. He doesn't need to put it in his book because everybody already knows. That's pretty remarkable to me. One more thing. The first witnesses were women who were afraid. The reason this is significant is that women in that day were not considered worthy witnesses. If you had a dispute with someone else and the only witness was a woman, sorry, she couldn't take the stand. In that day, women were simply not considered trustworthy to be witnesses for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure what the cultural events were that led to that place, but I just know that's where it was. So for Mark, if he's making up this story, if he puts the words of testimony